Hi guys, Conor here for Force Intelligence, and the topic for today is intensity for hypertrophy. A topic that is well worth talking about, that isn't talked about as much, particularly with the abundance of research on volume and frequency coming out at the moment through people like Brad Schoenfeld and co. But intensity is definitely something that we need to consider in our program design for things like hypertrophy. Does it have the same role as it does in strength? No, but let's go explore the role it has. So, for starters, let's go into definition. So, how I define intensity would go into two subcategories. So, there is absolute intensity. That's more of your percentage of 1RM based thing. Weight in the bar, really, at the end of the day. Relative intensity is a form of measuring effort. So, some people associate intensity with effort. Like, for example, in bodybuilding communities, very often for people to reference like high intensity training or maybe like a dog crap training or something like that as being really high intensity, when usually those programs, decent in intensity, still like sets of 8 usually, but the effort is very high. That's one way of defining it, and I define that as absolute intensity. So for us guys designing programs, things such as how hard the set is in terms of are you going to failure or not? Is it sub-maximal? Things like RP, reps in reserve, this all falls into the absolute intensity subcategory. So with relative intensity as it relates to hypertrophy, so percentage of 1RM, it's probably most important for the mechanical tension pathways of hypertrophy. And for that, you want to see at least a 65% of 1RM used for these sort of lifts. And you don't actually have to go as close to failure as you would in other lifts. If you do 60% or maybe 65 to be safe for like sets of 3, there's definitely more than 5-6 reps in reserve. You will grow, granted you're not doing enough volume and all the rest of the stuff, but it is an individual trigger of hypertrophy via the mechanical tension pathway. If you do more, maybe like you're just sort of murking around that 60% of 1RM, maybe a tad lower, that's when absolute intensity becomes especially important. Not to say it's not important in the higher percentages, but it's a must when you're going a little bit lighter. And what we've seen in the research so far is there is a growing amount of benefits to going closer to failure, but it is not linear. For example, let's say over here would be 10 reps in reserve. You could do another 10 reps and you stop there. And this level here is the amount of hypertrophy you're going to get. And over here is muscular failure. You do see a relationship where the trend goes up. The closer you go to failure, the more things you're going to get out of it. But there is a certain amount of diminishing returns. So once you guys, especially as beginners, get into the 4-5 reps in reserve, so that means like gun to your head, because people need to learn how hard they actually can train for starters. 4 to 5 reps in the tank, you are starting to collect on most of the benefits. Maybe not all when you go to complete failure, but a good 70% I'd theorize. You go to 3 reps in reserve, 2 reps in reserve, you're nearly getting all the same benefits you do of failure. But, so then the follow-up question could be, why not just go to failure all the time if it's got the most benefits? Why sort of mix it around from that 5 to 0 reps in reserve range? Well, the closer you go to failure as well, the exponentially more fatiguing it is. So those extra 2 reps, from 2 reps in reserve to complete failure, might yield this much more hypertrophy, but might generate this much fatigue, therefore cutting into how much volume you can do, what you can recover from, and just generally like symptoms of overtraining and stuff like that. So I think as long as you're getting within 4 to 5 reps in reserve, you are growing a very decent amount. You're ticking a lot of boxes. There is a place to probably go closer towards failure from time to time. Progression schemes will usually have that built into them if they're done carefully, which we'll go into in a second. But yeah, most of your gains in the absolute range, the relative range will be within 4 reps in reserve. So how to apply these different ones to there's different methods of intensity to different exercises. I think the big compound basics sort of thing generally doing themselves better to your higher percentage of 1RM lifts. Thus, absolute intensity is probably more important, and you probably can keep a few more reps in reserve if you needed to. just focus on technique and stuff. Whereas your more isolated lifts, less complex lifts, potentially safer lifts, might benefit going closer and closer to failure. I don't think there's too much benefit going from 2 reps in reserve of a squat to failure. I don't think there's really a big range there, but there's a hell of a lot of downsides. You don't want to be failing in a squat, A, for technique reasons, B, for safety reasons usually. There might be the place here and there, but just save it for your powerlifting meet, save it for your testing times. Don't have it as a basis of your training, especially because of how fatiguing it is. So with that relative intensity, I want to mention one thing. So I mentioned 4 to 5 reps in reserve will work. And I do believe that's true, especially the more that, absolute intensity plays a role. But throughout your training career, that number might come slightly down. Once you're like 15 years into this game, you need to tick a lot of boxes to like stimulate growth. Diminishing returns does apply, so you really need to tick a lot of boxes. So I think that range might shift maybe to 3 reps in reserve. I think it's just a need to do more systemically damaging stuff as you become more and more advanced. But until then, you can always have 4 to 5 reps in the tank. So with knowing how many reps in the tank, here's an easy way you can figure it out. So let's say we do a genuine testing. So there could be researchers with you in a lab, or you could just have training partners yelling at you, a very good coach, and you test your 10 rep max in a bench press. Let's say you do 100 kilos for those 10 absolute reps. The last one is just coming out so slow and you just get there. How do you know how many reps in reserve you are? Well, for that given weight, so 100 kilos, if you do 6 reps in the future, and it hasn't been too long since then, there's probably 4 reps in the tank. So I think that's just a basic way of knowing. So to answer the question overall and the role that intensity plays in hypertrophy, it is relative to volume and frequency, of course, but there is a threshold figure, such as the absolute intensity, but the relative intensity, I think, can be periodized a lot more. So a classic way of periodizing your mesocycle might be starting, let's say you've got 3x10 on a leg extension. You could do week 1, 3 reps in reserve, week 2, 2 reps in reserve, week 3, 1 rep in reserve, and then last week take them all to failure, or just toggle in between 1 and failure. Simple way of progressing intensity. With our hypertrophic mesocycles, it's probably more important we progress volume more than intensity, but I don't think it's to say that intensity shouldn't be increased at all. So if I had to, I think I might have done a video already, I'm not sure when these things are coming out, looking at the role of a mesocycle with volume intensity for hypertrophy, and I mentioned that intensity will slightly rise throughout the mesocycle, particularly in the more relative side of things, but volume should be increasing probably even more so than intensity. That's all I've got for the topic today. So hopefully there's a few interesting thoughts, maybe a few good takeaways. So let us know how you go. Give it a shot and have a go at periodizing with that reps in reserve system or that RPE system. And give it a shot. All right, guys, enjoy.